Hello, thank you for visiting my reading room. I'm Nancy, reader and tutor, and also a small business owner of West Coast Polar Ice, Italian Ice, and Frozen Specialties. And tonight I'm going to continue in the Hardy Boys' The House on the Cliff, part 2, and I'm going to be reading, I'm not in my office tonight, I'm actually out having a coffee at a local McDonald's. So I thought, I'll just stay here and I will finish up, because there's nothing more wonderful than having a nice piping hot cup of steamy coffee with and reading. So I'm just going to enjoy and pick up right where we left off, provided that I have enough light. So I hope you all enjoy, and let's begin. This is A Cap on a Peg. "You've seen my father?" Frank asked the truck driver. "Well, I did see him on Monday," Sam said slowly, "but I don't know where he is now." "Come in and sit down," Frank urged. "Tell us everything you know." The four walked to the living room, and Mr. Bates sat down uneasily in a large chair. "Where did you see Mr. Hardy?" Mrs. Hardy asked eagerly. But Sam Bates was not to be hurried. "I'm a truck driver, see," he said. "Mostly I drive in Bayport, but sometimes I have to run to another town. That's how I come to be out there that morning." "Out where?" "Along the shore road. I'm sure it was Monday, because when I came home for supper, my wife had been doing the washing, and she only does that on Monday." "That was the day Dad left," Joe exclaimed. "Well, please go on with the story," Frank prodded Sam Bates. "Where did you see him?" The truck driver explained that his employer had sent him to a town down the coast to deliver some furniture. "I was about a half mile from the old Pullet place when I saw a man walking along the road. I waved to him, like I always do to people in the country, and then I see it's Mr. Hardy." "You know my father?" Frank asked. "Only from his pictures, but I'm sure it was him." "Dad left here in a sedan," Joe spoke up. "Did you see one around?" "No, I didn't." "What was the man wearing?" Mrs. Hardy asked. "Well, let's see. Dark brown trousers and a brown and black plaid sport jacket. He wasn't wearing a hat, but I think he had a brown cap in one hand." Mrs. Hardy's face went white. "Yes, that was my husband." After a moment, she added, "Can you tell us anything more?" "I'm afraid not, ma'am," the trucker said. "You see, I was in kind of a hurry that morning, so I didn't notice nothing else. He arose to leave." "We certainly thank you for coming to tell us, Mr. Bates," Mrs. Hardy said. "Yes, you've given us a valuable lead," Frank added. "Now we'll know where to look for Dad." "I sure hope he shows up," the driver said, walking toward the door. "Let me know if I can help any." When the man had left, Joe turned to Frank, puzzled. "Do you suppose Dad hid his car and was walking to the Pollitt house? If so, why? Maybe he picked up a clue at that deserted farmhouse on Hillcrest Road," Frank suggested, "and it led to the old Pollitt place. If he left his car somewhere, he must have been planning to investigate the haunted house without being seen. Something must have happened to him," Joe cried out. "Frank, I'll bet he went to Pollitt's and that fake ghost got him. Let's go look for Dad right away." But Mrs. Hardy broke in. Her expression was firm. "I don't want you boys to go to that house alone. Maybe you just better notify the police and let them make a search." The brothers looked at each other. Finally, Frank, realizing how alarmed she was, said, "Mother, it is possible Dad is there spying on some activities offshore, and he's all right, but can't leave the phone to phone you. The Pollitt line must have been disconnected. If Joe and I go out there and find him, we can bring back a report." Mrs. Hardy gave a wan smile. "You're very convincing, Frank, when you put it that way. All right, I'll give my permission, but you mustn't go alone." "Why not, Mother? We can look out for ourselves," Joe insisted. "Get some of the boys to go with you." "There's safety in numbers," his mother said. The boys agreed to this plan and got busy on the telephone rounding up their pals. Chet Morgan and Biff Hooper agreed to go, and they suggested asking Tony Prideaux and Phil Cohen, two more of the Hardy Boys' friends at Bayport High. Phil owned a motorcycle. He and Tony said they could go along. Shortly after lunch, the group set out. Chet rode with Frank, Biff with Joe, and Tony with Phil. The 3 motorcycles went out of Bayport, past the Tower Mansion, and along the shore road. They passed the Kane farmhouse, Hillcrest Road, and at last came in sight of the steep cliff rising from Barmet Bay and crowned by the rambling frame house where Felix Paulet had lived. All this time they had watched carefully for a sign of Mr. Hardy's car, but found none. "Your dad hid it well," Chet remarked. "It's possible someone stole it," Frank told him. As the boys came closer to the Paulet property, Phil said to Tony, "Lonely looking place, isn't it?" "Sure is. Good haunt for a ghost." When they were still some distance from the lane, Frank, in the lead, brought his motorcycle to a stop and signaled the other 2 drivers to do likewise. "What's the matter?" Chet asked. "We better sneak up on the place quietly. If we go any further and the ghost is there, he'll hear the motorcycles. I vote we leave them here under the trees and go the rest of the way on foot." The boys hid their machines in a clump of bushes beside the road, and then the 6 searchers went on toward the lane. "We'll separate here," Frank decided. 3 of us take one side of the lane and the rest the other side. Keep to the bushes as much as possible, and when we get near the house, lay low for a while and watch the place. When I whistle, you can come out of the bushes and go up to the house." "That's a good idea," Joe agreed. "Biff, Tony, and I will take the left side of the road." "Okay." The boys entered the weeds and undergrowth on either side of the lane. In a few minutes, they were lost to view, and only an occasional snapping and crackling of branches indicated their presence. The 6 sleuths crept forward, keeping well in from the lane. After about 10 minutes, Frank raised his hand as a warning to Chet and Phil. He had caught a glimpse of the house through the dense thicket. They went on cautiously until they reached the edge of the bushes. From behind the scene of leaves, they looked forward. They looked toward the old building. An expression of surprise crossed Frank's face. "Someone's living here," he exclaimed in astonishment. From where the boys stood, they hardly recognized the old place. Weeds that had filled the flower beds on their last visit had been completely cleared away. Leaves and twigs had been raked up and the grass cut. A similar change had been wrought in the house. The hanging shutters had been in place and the broken library window glass replaced. "What do you suppose has happened?" Chet whispered. Frank was puzzled. "Let's wait a minute before we go any further." The boys remained at the edge of the bushes, watching the place. A short time later, a woman came out of the house carrying a basket of clothes. She walked over to the clothesline stretched between 2 trees and began to hang up the laundry. Shortly afterward, a man came out and strode across the yard to a shed where he started filling a basket with logs. The boys looked at one another in bewilderment. They had expected to find the same sinister and deserted place they had visited previously. Instead, here was a scene of domestic tranquility. "There's not much use in our hiding any longer," Frank whispered. "Let's go out and question these people." He gave the prearranged whistle. The other 3 boys appeared, and the entire group walked boldly up the lane and across the yard. The man in the woodshed saw them first and straightened up, staring at them with an expression of annoyance. The woman at the clothesline heard their footsteps and turned to face them, her hands on her hips. Her gaunt face wore an unpleasant scowl. "What do you want?" demanded the man, emerging from the shed. He was short and thin, with close-cropped hair, and he needed a shave. His complexion was swarthy, his eyes narrow under coarse black brows. At the same time, another man came out of the kitchen and stood on the steps. He was stout and red-haired with a scraggly mustache. "Yeah, who are you?" he asked. "We didn't know anyone was living here," Frank explained, edging over the kitchen door. He wanted to get a look inside the house if possible. "Well, we're living here now," said the red-haired man, "and we don't like snoopers." "We're not snooping," Frank declared. "We're looking for a man who has disappeared from Bayport." grunted the woman. "Why do you think he's around here?" the thin man put it. "He was last seen in this neighborhood." "What does he look like?" "Tall and dark, He was wearing a brown suit and sports jacket and cap. There hasn't been anybody around here since we rented this place and moved in, the red-haired man said gruffly. There seemed to be no prospect of gaining information from the unpleasant trio, so the boys started to leave. But Frank had reached the kitchen door. As he glanced in, he gave a start. Hanging on a peg was a brown sports cap. It looked exactly like the one his father owned, and which he had worn the morning that he had disappeared. Chapter 9, Plan of Attack. I'm very thirsty, Frank said quickly to the occupants of the Pollitt house. May I have a drink? The red-haired man and the woman looked at each other. They obviously wished to get rid of their visitors as soon as possible, but they could not refuse such a reasonable request. Come into the kitchen, said the man grudgingly. Frank followed him through the door. As he passed the cap, he took a good look at it. It was his father's, and there were stains on it which looked like blood. The red-headed man pointed to a sink on the other side of the room. On it stood a plastic cup. Help yourself, he said gruffly. Frank went across the room and ran some water from the faucet. As he raised the cup to his lips, his mind was racing. On his way out, he glanced again at the peg. The cap was gone. Frank gave no sign that he had noticed anything amiss. He walked out into the yard and joined the other 5 boys. I guess we may as well be going, he said nonchalantly. You might as well, snapped the woman. There's no stranger around here, I tell you. The boys started off down the lane. When they were out of sight of the house, Frank stopped and turned to his companions. Do you know what I saw in that kitchen? He asked tensely. What? Dad's cap hanging on a peg. Then he has been there, cried Joe. They were lying. Yes, Frank continued, and there were bloodstains on the cap. Bloodstains, Joe exclaimed. That means he must be in trouble. Frank, we've got to go back. We sure do, his brother agreed, but I wanted to tell you all this first. What do you think we should do? Chet asked. I'll ask those people in the house about the cap and force a showdown, Frank declared tersely. We've got to find out where Dad is. Resolutely, the boys started back to the Pollitt house. When they reached the yard, they found the 2 men and the woman standing by the shed, talking earnestly. The woman caught sight of them and spoke warningly to the red-haired man. What do you want now? He demanded, advancing toward the boys. We want to know about the sports cap in the kitchen, said Frank firmly. What cap? There is no cap in there. There isn't now, but there was. It was hanging on a peg when I went in for a drink. I don't know anything about no cap, persisted the man. Perhaps we'd better ask the police to look around, Joe suggested. The red-headed man glanced meaningly at the woman. The other man stepped forward. I know the cap this boy means, he said. It's mine. What about it? It isn't yours, and you know it, Frank declared. That cap belongs to the man we're looking for. I tell you it is my cap, snapped the swarthy man, showing his yellowed teeth in a snarl. Don't tell me I'm lying. The red-haired man intervened. You're mistaken, Klein, he said. I know the cap they mean now. It's the one I found on the road a few days ago. Guess you're right, Red, Klein conceded hastily. You found it? Asked Frank incredulously. Sure, I found it. A brown cap with bloodstains on it. That's the one. But why did you hide it when I went into the kitchen? Well, to tell the truth, them bloodstains make me nervous. I didn't know but what there might be some trouble come of it, so I thought I'd better keep that cap out of sight. Where did you find it? Joe asked. About a mile from here. On the shore road? Yes, it was lying right in the middle of the road. When was this? A couple days ago. Just after we moved in here. Let's see that cap, Chet Morton suggested. We want to make sure of this. As Red moved reluctantly toward the kitchen, the woman sniffed. I don't see why you're making all the fuss about an old cap, she said. Coming around here disturbing honest folks. We're sorry if we're bothering you, said Joe, but this is a very serious matter. Red came out of the house holding the cap. He tossed it to Frank. The boy turned back the inside flap, and there he found what he was looking for, the initials F.H. printed in gold on the leather band. It's Dad's cap, all right. I don't like the look of those bloodstains, said Joe in a low voice. He must have been badly hurt. Are you sure you found this on the road? Frank asked, still suspicious. You don't think I'd lie about it, do you? Red answered belligerently. I can't contradict you, but I'm going to turn this over to the police, Frank told him. If you know anything more about it, you'd better speak up now. He doesn't know anything about it, shrilled the woman angrily. Go away and don't bother us. Didn't he tell you he found the cap on the road? I told him to burn up the dirty thing, but he wanted to have it cleaned and wear it. The boys turned away, Frank still holding the cap. Come on, fellows, he said. Let's get out of here. As the boys started down the lane, they cast a last glance back at the yard. The woman and the two men were standing just where the young sleuths had found them. The woman was motionless, her hands up on her hips. Red was standing with his arms folded, and Klein, the swarthy man, was leaning against a tree. All three were gazing intently and silently after the departing boys. I'm sure that those people know more about Dad's cap than they're telling, Frank said grimly, as the boys mounted the motorcycles and rode back toward Bayport. What are you planning to do next? Phil asked as he pulled his machine alongside Frank's. I'm going right to Chief Collick and tell him the whole story. Okay, we're with you. The boys rode directly to police headquarters and left their motorcycles in the parking lot. Chief Collick looked up at his 6 visitors, ushered them into his office. Well, he said heartily, this is quite a delegation. What can I do for you? As Frank and Joe took turns, with an occasional graphic illustration from one of the other boys, they told the full story and showed him the blood-stained cap. Chief Collick looked grave. I don't like the sound of this at all, he said finally. We must find your father at once. This cap is a good clue. Then he went on, of course you realize that the area where the Pollitt house is located is outside the limits of Bayport, so my man can't go there, but I'll get in touch with Captain Ryder of the state police at once, so he can assign men to the case. The boys thanked the chief for his help and left. Chet, Tony, Biff, and Phil went their separate ways, while Frank and Joe turned toward home. They decided not to upset their mother about the blood-stained cap, but merely tell her that the state police would take over the search for her husband. I still think there's some kind of connection between Dad's disappearance and the smuggling outfit and the house on the cliff, Frank declared. What I've been wondering, said Joe, is where those 2 motorboats came from that day Jones was attacked. We didn't see them out in the ocean earlier, at least not both of them. That's right. They could have come right out from under the cliff. You mean, Frank, there must be a secret harbor in there? Might be. Here's the way it could work. Dad suspects smugglers are operating in this territory from a base that he had been unable to find. Frank spread his arms. The base is the old Pollitt place. What more do you want? But the house is on top of a cliff. There could be a secret passage from the house to a hidden harbor at the foot of the cliff. Good night, Frank. It sounds so reasonable. And perhaps that explains why the kidnappers got away with Jones so quickly on Saturday. If they left the Kane farmhouse just a little while before we did, we should have been able to get within sight of their car, but we didn't. You mean they turned in at the Pollitt place? Why not? Probably Jones is hidden there right now. And maybe Dad too, Joe cried out excitedly. That's right. I'm against just sitting and waiting for the state troopers to find him. How about asking Tony if he will lend us his motorboat so we can investigate the foot of that cliff? I get you, Joe agreed enthusiastically. And if we pick up any information, we can turn it over to the state police and they can raid the Pollitt place. Chapter 10. A Watery Tunnel. When the brothers arrived home, Joe and Frank assured their mother that the state police would soon find Mr. Hardy. Some of the anxiety left her face as she listened to her son's reassuring words. When she went to the kitchen to start preparations for dinner, the boys went to phone Tony Preto. After Frank explained their plan to him, he agreed at once to let them use the Napoli, provided they took him along. I wouldn't miss it for anything, he said, but I can't go until afternoon. Have to do some work for my dad in the morning. I'll meet you at the boathouse at 2 o'clock. Swell, Tony. I have a job of my own in the morning. Chet called a few minutes later. As Frank finished telling him about the plan, he whistled. You fellows have got your nerve all right, but count me in, will you? I started this thing with you, and I'd like to finish. We've got to find your father. After Chet had said goodbye, Joe asked his brother, "What's on for this morning?" "I want to go down to the waterfront and talk to Pretzel Pete again. He might have another clue. Also, I want to find out where the Marco Polo is due back here." Joe nodded. "I get it. You think something may be going on then." "Right. And if we can find Dad and lead the Coast Guard to the smugglers before the boat docks, brother, that's a big order." By 9 o'clock the following morning, Frank and Joe were down at the Bayport docks. Pretzel Pete was not in evidence. "We'd better be cagey about asking where the Marco Polo's coming in," Frank cautioned. "The smugglers probably have spies around here, and we'd sure be targets." Acting as if there's no problems on their minds, Frank and Joe strolled along whistling. Once they joined a group of people who were watching a sidewalk merchant. The man was demonstrating little jumping animals. Frank and Joe laughed as they brought a monkey and a kangaroo. "Iola and Callie will get a kick out of these," Joe predicted. "Say, Frank, here comes Pretzel Pete now," Joe whispered. The Hardys went up the street, saying in a loud voice, in case anyone was listening, that they were hungry and glad to see Pete. "Nobody can make pretzels like yours," Joe exclaimed. "Give me a dozen, 2 for my mouth and 10 for my pockets." As Pretzel Pete laughed and pulled out a cellophane bag to fill the order, Frank said in a whisper, "Heard anything new?" "Not a thing, son," Pete would go on without moving his lips, "but I may know something tomorrow." "How come?" "The Marco Polo is docking really early, 5 a.m. I heard Allie Singe is one of the crew. I'll try to get a line on him." "Great, we'll be seeing you." The boys moved off, and to avoid arousing any suspicion as to why they were in the area, headed for a famous fish market. "Mother would be surprised to see our morning's catch," Joe said with a grin as he picked out a large bluefish. The brothers did not discuss the exciting information Pretzel Pete had given them until they were to the safety of their own home. Then Joe burst out, "Frank, if the Marco Polo gets offshore during the night, it'll have to lay outside until it's time to dock. And that'll give those smugglers a real break in picking up the stolen drugs," Frank added. "Maybe we should pass along our suspicions to the Coast Guard." "Not yet," Joe objected. "All we have to go on is Pretzel Pete's statements about Ally Singe. Maybe we'll learn more this afternoon, and then we can report it." "I guess you're right," Frank concluded. "If those smugglers are holding Dad and find out that we've tipped off the Coast Guard, they'll certainly harm him." "You have a point." When Frank and Joe reached the Preto boathouse at 2 o'clock, Tony and Chet were already there. Tony was tuning up the motor, which purred evenly. "No word from your dad yet?" Tony asked. The Hardys shook their heads as they stepped aboard. The Napoli was a rangy, powerful craft with graceful lines and was the pride of Tony's life. The boat moved slowly out into the waters of Barmet Bay and then gathered speed as it headed toward the ocean. "Rough water," Frank remarked, as breaking swells hit the hull. Salt spray dashed over the bow of the Napoli as it plunged on through the whitecaps. Bayport soon became a speck nestled at the curve of the horseshoe-shaped body of water. Reaching the ocean, Tony turned north. The boys could see the white line of the shore road rising and falling along the coast. Soon they passed the cane farm. 2 miles farther on, they came within sight of the cliff upon which the Pollitt house stood. It looked stark and forbidding above the rocks, its roof and chimneys silhouetted against the sky. "Pretty steep cliff," Tony observed. "I can't see how anyone could make his way up and down that slope to get to the house." "That's probably why nobody has suspected the place of being a smuggling base," Frank replied. "But perhaps when we look around, we'll find an answer." Tony steered the boat closer toward the shore so that it would not be visible from the Pollitt grounds. Then he slackened speed in order that the sound of the engine would be less noticeable, and the craft made its way toward the bottom of the cliff. There were currents here that demanded skillful navigation, but Tony brought the Napoli through them easily, and at last the boat was chugging along close to the face of the cliff. The boys eagerly scanned the formidable wall of rock. It was scarred, and seemed that the base had been eaten away by the incessant battering of waves. There was no indication of a path. Suddenly, Tony turned the wheel sharply. The Napoli swerved swiftly to one side. He gave it power, and the craft leaped forward with a roar. "What's the matter?" Frank asked in alarm. Tony gazed straight ahead, tense and alert. Another shift of the wheel, and the Napoli swerved again. Then Chet and the Hardys saw the danger. There were rocks at the base of the cliff. One of them, black and sharp, like an ugly tooth, jutted out of the water almost as at the boat's side. Only Tony's quick eye had saved the Napoli from hitting it. They had blundered into a veritable maze of reefs which extended for several yards ahead. Tony's passengers held their breaths. It seemed impossible that they could run the gauntlet of those rocks without tearing out the bottom of the craft. But luck was with them. The Napoli dodged the last dangerous rock and shot forward into open water. Tony sank back with a sigh of relief. "Phew, that was close," he exclaimed. "I didn't see those rocks until we were right on top of them. If we'd ever struck one of them, we'd have been goners." Frank, Joe, and Chet nodded in solemn agreement. Then suddenly Frank cried out, "Turn back! I think I saw an opening." Tony swung the boat around. The opening which Frank had spotted was a long, narrow tunnel. It led right through the cliff. "This might be the secret entrance," Joe exclaimed. "I think it's large enough for the boat to go through," said Tony. Want me to try it?" Frank nodded tensely. "Go ahead." The Napoli slipped through the opening and in a few moments came out into a pond of considerable extent. The boys looked about expectantly. Steep slopes covered with scraggly trees and bushes reached to the water's edge, but there was no path or indication that any human being ever came down to the pond. Suddenly, Frank gave a gasp of surprise and said, "Look to my right, fellas." Among the thickets at the base of the steepest slope stood a man. He was very tall. His face was weather-beaten and his lips thin and cruel. He stood quietly, looking at the boys without a shadow of expression on his sinister face. Upon realizing he had been observed, the man shouted, "Get out of here!" Tony throttled the engine and Frank called, "We aren't doing any harm." "I said get out. This is private property." The boys hesitated. Instantly, the man, as though to back up his commands, reached significantly toward the holster of a revolver. Turn that boat around and beat it," he snapped. "And don't ever come back here. Not if you know what's good for you." The boys realized that nothing would be gained by argument. Tony slowly brought the boat around. "Okay," Joe cried cheerfully. The stranger did not reply. He stood gazing fixedly after them, his left hand pointing to the exit, his right tapping the gun holster as the motorboat made its way out through the tunnel. "Looks as if he didn't want us around," remarked Tony facetiously as soon as the Napoli was in the open water again. "He sure didn't," Frank exclaimed. "I expected him to start popping that gun at any moment." "He might have had an important reason." "Who and what do you suppose he is?" Tony asked in bewilderment. "Fellows," Frank said thoughtfully, "I think that man might have been Snapman." Chapter 11, Cliff Watchers. "Frank," Joe exclaimed, "I think you've hit it. That man had no reason to act the way he did unless he's covering up something." "Something like smuggling, you mean," said Chet. "He must be Snapman or one of his gang." "And," Frank went on, "the fact that he was in the cove meant that he has some connection with the house on the cliff." "Snapman, king of the smugglers," Tony whistled. "You guys really get in some interesting situations." I'll bet that he's one of the fellows who chased Jones that day in the motorboat, Joe cried. And tried to kill him, Frank continued the thought. Let's get away from here, Chet urged. Why should we go now? Frank demanded. We've stumbled onto something important. That hidden pond may be the smugglers' base. But if they use the house, how do we get to it? Tony asked. Those cliffs up from the pond were mighty steep. There must be some way that we couldn't see, Joe said. What say we hang around here for a while and find out what we can? Tony caught the Hardys' enthusiasm and agreed to keep the motorboat in the vicinity of the cliff. That fellow may be keeping his eye on us, and we don't want him to know that we're watching the place, Frank observed. Let's run back to the bay and cruise up and down a little while, and then return. Chet sighed. I'm glad none of you argued with that armed man. Right, Joe replied. As it is, he must think we were simply out for a cruise and wandered into that tunnel by mistake. Yes, his brother agreed. If he'd known we were hunting for Dad, he might have acted very differently. In the late afternoon, Tony took the Napoli back to the suspected shore spot. Keeping well out from the breaking waves, he cruised along the cliff. The boys kept a sharp eye on the location of the tunnel. As the boat passed, it was just then they were just able to distinguish the narrow opening in the rocks. I won't be able to go in there after a while, Tony remarked. The tide's coming in. At high tide, I'll bet that tunnel is filled with water. Suddenly, Tony swung his craft so hard to the right that the other boys lost their balance. Sorry, fellows, he said. That was a log. Oh, he shut off his engine in a flash and leaned over the gunwale. His companions picked themselves up and asked what had happened. Propeller started to foul up with some wire on that log. Tony began to peel off his clothes. Get me some pliers, will you? Frank opened a locker and found a pair. Taking them, Tony dived overboard. A minute later, he reappeared and climbed in. I'm lucky, he said, just plain lucky. 2 seconds more and all that wire would have been wound up around the propeller, and the log would have knocked it off. Good night, Chet exclaimed. It would have been a long swim home. Joe slapped Tony on the back. Good work, boy. I'd hate to see that Napoli out of commission. Chet and Frank hauled the log aboard so it would not damage any other craft. This is a fence post with barbed wire, Chet said. Wowee! It's good you spotted that log, Tony. Tony dressed, then started that engine. He cruised around for more than an hour, but the boys saw no sign of life about the base of the cliff. They could see the Pollitt house, but to their amazement, no lights appeared on in it as twilight came. How much longer do you think we should stay out here? Chet asked. I'm getting hungry. I have a few pretzels and a candy bar, but that's not much for 4 of us, Joe remarked. Aha, crowed Tony. I have a surprise for you. I stowed away a little food before we took off. With that, he pulled a paper bag from the locker and passed each boy a large sandwich, a piece of chocolate cake, and a bottle of lemon soda. You deserve a medal, Chet remarked as he bit into a layer of ham and cheese. You sure do, Frank agreed. I think we should stay right here for a while and watch. It's my guess the smugglers will be on the job tonight. Don't forget that the Marco Polo is docking tomorrow morning. I get it, said Chet. If she lays ashore or streams in slowly, it'll give Ally Singe a chance to drop the stolen drugs overboard to Snapman. Correct, said Frank. Tony looked intently at the Hardys. Is it your idea to keep Snapman from meeting Ally Singe? But what about your father? I thought we came out here to get a line on how to rescue him. The brothers exchanged glances. Then Joe said, Of course, that's our main purpose, but we hope that we can do both. Twilight deepened into darkness, and lights could have been seen here and there through the haze. The cliff was only a black smudge, and the house above was still unlighted. Suddenly, the boys heard a muffled sound. Tony slowed the Napoli, and they listened intently. Another motorboat, Tony whispered. The sound seemed to come from the cliff. Straining their eyes in that direction, the 4 were at least able to distinguish a faint moving light. Can you head over that way, Tony? Frank asked in a low voice. And could you take a chance on turning off our lights? Sure, here goes. The wind's blowing from the land, so our engine won't be heard from the shore. The boys were tense with excitement as the Nepali moved slowly toward the light. As the boat crept nearer the cliff, they could dimly distinguish the outline of a motorboat. The craft seemed to be making its way carefully out of the very face of the cliff. It must have come from that tunnel, Joe whispered to Frank. Yes. The Nepali went closer. In imminent danger of being discovered or of being washed ashore onto the rocks. Finally, the other boat slowed to a crawl. Then came the faint clatter of oars and low voices. The motorboat had evidently met a rowboat. The next moment, with an abrupt roar, the motorboat turned and raced out to sea at an ever-increasing rate of speed. What can it be doing? And where can it be going? Said Tony in amazement. Out to meet the Marco Polo? Probably, Frank replied, and we'd never catch it. I wonder where the rowboat's going. The four boys waited in silence for several minutes. Then the rattle of oars came again. This time the sound was closer. The rowboat was coming toward them. What'll we do now? Tony asked. Turn off your engine, Frank whispered. Tony complied. Through the gloom, suddenly came snatches of conversation from the rowboat. 100 pounds, they heard a man say harshly, and then the rest of the sentence was lost. There was a lengthy murmur of voices. Then, I don't know, it's risky. The wind died down just then, and two voices could be heard distinctly. Ally Singe's share, one man was saying. That's right. We can't forget him, the gruff voice replied. I hope they get away all right. What are you worrying about? Of course they'll get away. We've been spotted, you know. It's all your imagination. Nobody suspects. Those boys at the house, just dumb kids. If they come nosing around again, we'll knock 'em off on the head. I don't like this rough stuff. It's dangerous. We've got to do it, or we'll wind up in the pen. What's the matter with you tonight? You're nervous. I'm worried. I've got a hunch we'd better clear out of here. Clear out? Replied the other contemptuously. Are you crazy? Why, this place is as safe as church. The man laughed sardonically. Haven't we got all the squealers locked up? And tonight we make the big cleanup and get away. Well, maybe you're right, said the first man doubtfully. But still, his voice died away as the boat entered the tunnel. Joe grabbed Frank's arm. Did you hear that? All the squealers locked up? I'll bet Dad's one of them, and he's a prisoner somewhere around here. And this is the hideout of Snapmen. And the other smugglers he was after, Frank added. I don't like this, Chet spoke up. Let's leave here and get the police. Frank shook his head. It would take so long, we might goof the whole thing. Tell you what, Joe and I will follow the rowboat through the tunnel. How? On foot or swim? I don't think it's deep along the edges. You mean Chet and I will wait here? Tony asked. No, Frank answered. You two can beat it back to Bayport and notify the Coast Guard. Tell them we're on the track of smugglers and ask them to send some men here. And tell them our suspicions about Ally Singe and the Marco Polo, Joe added. They can radio the captain to keep an eye on him. Okay, said Tony. I'll do that. First I'll put you ashore. Don't go too close or you'll hit those rocks and wreck the boat, Frank warned. Joe and I can swim to shore. Then we'll work around in the tunnel and see what we can find. If we do discover anything, we'll wait at the entrance and show the men from the Coast Guard where to go when they get here. Tony edged the boat in as close to the dark shore as he dared without lights. Quickly, Frank and Joe took off their slacks, t-shirts, sweaters, and sneakers. They rolled them up and with twine which Tony provided, tied the bundles on top of their heads. Then they slipped over the side into the water. The Nepali sped off. Frank and Joe were only a few yards from the rocks, and after a short swim, emerged on the mainland. Well, here goes, Joe whispered, heading for the tunnel. Chapter 12, The Secret Passage. Cautiously, Frank and Joe made their way across the slippery rocks. Suddenly, there was a loud splash as Joe lost his footing. "Are you all right?" Frank whispered as he came up to where his brother was standing in the shallow water at the edge of the cliff. "Yes. For a moment I thought I'd sprained my ankle," Joe replied tensely, "but it seems to be okay now." "Give me your hand," Frank whispered, and quickly pulled Joe back onto the rocks. The Hardys had landed at a point some 25 yards from the tunnel opening, but the climb over the treacherous rocks was so difficult that the distance seemed even longer. It was very dark in the shadow of the steep cliff. The waves breaking against the rocks had a lonely and foreboding sound. "Good night," Joe muttered. "Aren't we ever coming to that tunnel?" "Take it easy," Frank advised. "It can't be much farther." "I hope Tony and Chet will hurry back with help," Joe said. "This is a ticklish job. If anybody's on guard here, we'll certainly be at a disadvantage," Frank remarked in a barely audible tone. "Watch out!" By this time, they had reached the entrance to the tunnel. After a few cautious steps, they discovered that the narrow piece of land between the water and the base of the cliff was covered by a thick growth of bushes. Frank turned to Joe. If we try to walk through all that stuff," he whispered, "we're sure to be heard. That is, if those men are in here someplace." Joe grunted in agreement. "What shall we do?" Tentatively, Frank put one foot in the water from the rock on which he was standing. "It isn't deep," he said. "I guess we can wade through." The boys hugged the wall and started off. Fortunately, the water came only to their knees because there was a shelf of rocks all along the way. The brothers' hearts beat wildly. What would they find ahead of them? The boys had not heard a sound since entering the tunnel. It appeared that the men in the rowboat had gone on to some secret hiding place. "I think I'll risk my flashlight," Frank said in a low-toned voice as they reached the pond. We can't find out anything without it." He pulled one he was carrying from its waterproof case and snapped it on. The yellow beam shone over the pond. There was no sign of the rowboat. "How do you think those men got out of here?" Joe asked. "Do you suppose there's another opening?" Frank turned the flashlight onto the steep aisles surrounding the water. "I don't see any. My guess is that those men hid the boat someplace. Let's make a thorough search." Slowly, the brothers began to walk around the edge of the pond, brushing aside the heavy growth and peering among the bushes. They had about given up in despair as they reached the section by the far wall of the tunnel. Then, as Frank beamed the flashlight over the thicket, he exclaimed hoarsely, "Look! A door!" Joe whispered tensely. The door had been so cleverly concealed that it would not have been seen in full daylight except at close quarters. The glare of the flashlight, however, brought the artificial screen of branches and leaves into sharp relief against the dark cliffside. "This explains it," Joe said. "The men in the boat went through here. I wonder where it goes." In order to avoid detection, Frank extinguished his light before trying to open the door. He swung it open inch by inch, half expecting to find lights and people around. But there was only darkness. Luckily, the door had made no noise. Frank turned on his light again. Ahead was a watery passageway some 10 feet wide and 25 feet long, with a ledge running along one side. At the end was a tiny wharf with a rowboat tied to a post. "This is fantastic," Joe whispered. "And it must have been here a long time. Do you suppose it's connected with the Pollitt place?" "If it is, it could mean old Mr. Pollitt was mixed up with the smugglers," Frank answered. "Hey, do you suppose Snapman is his nephew?" Excited over this possible new angle in the case, Frank and Joe stepped onto the ledge. They dressed, then quickly inched forward. Reaching the wharf, they looked about them as Frank beamed his flashlight on the walls. "Hold it," Joe whispered. Directly ahead was a crude arch in the rock. Beyond it, the boys could see a steep flight of stone steps. Their heart pounded with excitement. "We've found it," Frank whispered. "This must be the secret passageway." "Yes," Joe agreed. "And from the distance we've come to figure out that we're right underneath the house on the cliff. Let's go up." The light cast strange shadows in the passage through the rocks. Water dripped from the walls. The boys tiptoed toward the stealthily began to ascend. As they crept up the stairs, Frank flashed the light ahead of them. Shortly they could see that the steps ended at a heavy door. Its framework was set into the wall of rock. Above them was only a rocky ceiling. When Frank and Joe reached the door, they hesitated. Both were thinking, if we go through that door and find the gang of smugglers, we'll never get out. But on the other hand, we must find Dad. Frank stepped forward, pressed his ear against the door, and listened intently. There was not a sound beyond. He turned off the light and looked carefully around the sides of the door to see if he could catch a glimmer of any illumination from the other side. There was only darkness. "I guess there's no one inside," he said to Joe. "Let's see if we can open it up." Frank felt for the latch. The door did not move. "It must be locked," he whispered. "Try it again. Maybe it's just stuck." Frank put his hand on the latch, this time also pushing the door with his shoulder. Suddenly, with the noise, which echoed from wall to wall, the latch snapped and the door swung open. Joe stepped forward, but Frank put out a restraining hand. "Wait," he cautioned. "That noise may bring someone." Tensely, they stood alert for the slightest sound, but none came. Hopeful that there was no one in the area beyond, Frank switched on the flashlight. The vivid beam cut the darkness and revealed a gloomy cave hewn out of rock in the very center of the cliff. The boys wondered if it had been a natural cave. It was filled with boxes, bales, and packages distributed about the floor and piled against the walls. Smuggled goods, Frank and Joe thought. The fact that the majority of the boxes bore labels of foreign countries seemed to verify their suspicions. Convinced that the cave was unoccupied, the boys stepped through the doorway and looked about for another door or opening. They saw none. Was this the end of the trail? But it couldn't be, the young sleuths thought. Those men went someplace. Bolts of beautiful silk had been tossed on top of some of the bales. Valuable tapestries were also lying carelessly around. In one corner, 4 boxes were piled on top of one another. Frank accidentally knocked the flashlight against one of these, and it gave forth a hollow sound. "It's empty," he whispered. An idea struck him that perhaps these boxes had been piled up to conceal some passage leading out of the secret storeroom. He mentioned his suspicion to Joe. But how could the men pile the boxes up there after they went out? His brother questioned. "This gang is smart enough for anything. Let's move these boxes away and maybe we'll find out." Frank seized the topmost box. It was very light, and he removed it from the pile without difficulty. "I thought so," Frank said with satisfaction. The flashlight had revealed the top of the door, which had been hidden from view. The boys lost no time in moving the other 3 boxes. Then Frank and Joe discovered how it was possible for the boxes to be piled up in such a position, in spite of the fact that the smugglers had left the cave and closed the door behind them. Attached to the bottom of the door was a thin wooden platform that projected out over the floor of the cave, and on this the boxes had been piled. "Very clever," Joe remarked. "Whenever anyone leaves the cave and closes the door, the boxes swing in with the platform, and it looks as though they were piled up on the floor." "Right. Well, let's see where the door leads," Frank proposed. He snapped off his light and with utmost caution opened the door. It made no sound. Again there was darkness ahead. What a maze! Frank whispered as he turned on his flash and beamed the light around. Another stone-lined passage with a flight of steps at the end. Suddenly, Frank stiffened and laid a warning hand on his brother's arm. "Voices," he said in a low tone, and snapped off his light. The boys listened intently. They could hear a man's voice in the distance. Neither could distinguish what he was saying, for he was still too far away, but gradually the tones grew louder. Then, to the brothers' alarm, they heard footsteps. Hastily, they retreated into the secret cave. "Quick, the door," Frank urged. They closed it tightly. "Now the boxes. If those men come in here, they'll notice that the boxes have been moved." He turned on the light, but shielded it with his hand. Swiftly, Joe piled the empty boxes back onto the platform that projected from the bottom of the door. He worked as silently and quickly as possible, but could hear the footsteps drawing closer and closer. Finally, the topmost box was in place. "Out the other door," Frank hissed into Joe's ear. They sped across the floor of the cave toward the door opening onto the stairs they had recently ascended. But hardly had they reached it before they heard a rattle at the latch of the door on the opposite side of the cave. "We haven't time," Frank whispered. "Hide." The beam of the flashlight revealed a number of boxes close to the door. On top of those, someone had thrown a heavy bolt of silk, the folds of which hung down to the floor. The brothers scrambled swiftly behind the boxes, pressing themselves close against the wall. They had just enough time to hide and switch out Frank's light before they heard the other door open. "There's a bunch of drugs in that shipment that came in 3 weeks ago," they heard a husky voice say. "We'll take it upstairs, Burke says. Burke says he can get rid of it for us right away. No use leaving it down here. Got to make room for the new shipment." "Right," the Hardys heard someone else reply. "Anyone else go up?" "No, I'll switch on the light." There was a click, and suddenly the cave was flooded with light. It had been wired for electricity. Frank and Joe crouched in their hiding place, holding their breaths in terror. Would they be discovered? Footsteps slowly approached the boxes behind which they were concealed. Chapter 13, A Startling Discovery. Frank and Joe tried to crowd themselves into the smallest space possible as the men came closer and nearer to their hiding place. The electric light bulb hanging from the center of the ceiling cast such a strong illumination over the cave that the boys felt certain they would be discovered. The boxes were placed a small distance apart, and only the fact that folds of silk hung down over the open spaces between the boxes prevented the boys from being seen immediately. However, through a crack in one of the crates, the Hardys could just make out 2 husky-looking figures. "Here's one. Oh, that Japanese silk," the boys heard one of the men say. "I'd better take a bolt of that up, too." Burke said he would place some more of it. Instantly, the same thought ran through both the brothers' minds. If the man picked up the silk, they would be surely found out. "Don't be crazy," the other man objected. "You know you won't get any credit for pushing a sale. Why break your arm lugging all that stuff upstairs?" "Well," the first man explained in a whining tone, "I thought maybe we could get rid of some more of this swag and make ourselves a little extra dough." "Nah," his companion snarled. "I can tell you, you ain't been with this gang long. You never get any thanks around here for thinking. If Bert don't like the extra stuff, the boss'll make you bring it all the way back down again." "Maybe you're right." "Sure, I'm right. My idea for the rest of us is this gang is to do just what Snapman tells us to do and no more." "You got something there, bud. Okay, we'll just take up the package of drugs and leave the rest." To the boys' relief, the men turned away and went over to the other side of the room. Frank and Joe did not dare peer out, but they could hear the sound of boxes being shifted. Then came the words, "All set? I've got the packages. Let's go." The switch was snapped, and the cave was plunged into darkness. The Hardys began to breathe normally again. The door to the corridor closed, and faintly the boys could detect the men's footsteps as they ascended the stairs at the end of it. When they had died away completely, Frank switched the flashlight on. "Wow," he said, giving a tremendous sigh of relief. "That was a close call. I sure thought they had us." "Me too," Joe agreed. "Wouldn't have had a chance with that pair. Looked like a couple of wrestlers." "Do we dare follow them?" "You bet. I'd say we've solved the smuggling mystery, but we still got to find out if they're holding Dad," Joe said grimly. "We'll have to watch our step even more carefully. We don't want to walk right into the whole ring of smugglers," Frank reminded him. "Right. I don't crave anything worse than what we've just gone through," said Joe. "I thought I'd die of suspense while that pair was in here." They crossed the room, opened the door, and started up the dark passageway. Presently, they were confronted by the flight of steps. Partway up, there was a landing, then more steps with the door at the top. "I'll go first," Frank offered. "Stick close behind me. I think I'll keep the flash off." "That's right," Joe agreed. "Snapman might have a guard at the top, and there's no use advertising our presence." Step by step, the boys crept upward to the inky blackness. Then they found themselves on a crude landing of planks. Carefully, they felt their way along the side of the rock until they reached the next flight of steps. Here the brothers stopped again to listen. Silence. "So far, so good," Frank whispered. "But somehow, I don't like this whole thing. I have a feeling we're walking into a trap." "We can't quit now," Joe answered, "but I admit I'm scared." Still groping in the dark, the boys climbed up and up until they were nearly winded. "Where are we?" Joe panted. "I feel as I've been climbing stairs for an hour." "Me too," Frank agreed. "The cliff doesn't look this high from the outside." They rested a minute, then continued their journey. Groping around, they finally reached another door. Frank hunted for the door handle. Finding it, he turned the knob ever so slightly to find out if the door was locked. "I can open it," Frank said in Joe's ear, "but we'd better wait a few minutes." "Every second is vital if Dad's a prisoner," Joe objected. Frank was about to accede to his brother's urging when both boys heard footsteps on the other side of the door. A chill ran down their spines. "Shall we run?" Joe said fearfully. "It wouldn't do us any good. Listen." There came a queer shuffling sound and a sigh from somewhere beyond the door. That was all. "Someone's in there," Frank breathed. Joe nodded in the darkness. The boys did not know what to do. The gang might have posted a sentry. If there was only one, the Hardys might be able to jump the man and disarm him. However, they probably could not do it without making some noise and attracting the attention of the rest of the smugglers. Frank and Joe gritted their teeth. They couldn't give up now. As they were trying to decide how to proceed, the situation took an unexpected turn. A door slammed in the distance. Then came the murmur of voices and the sound of advancing footsteps. "This nonsense has gone far enough," a man said angrily. "He'll write that note at once, or I'll know the reason why." The boys started. The voice was that of the man who had ordered them to leave the pond during the afternoon. "That's right, Chief," another voice spoke up. "Make him do as you say, or get the heat off us until we've got all the loot moved." "If he doesn't write it, he'll never get out of here alive," the first man promised coldly. Instantly, Frank and Joe thought of the note their mother had received. Was the man these smugglers were talking about their father? Or was he someone else, maybe Jones, who was to be forced to obey them or perhaps lose his life? The speakers went a short distance beyond the door behind which Frank and Joe were standing. Then they heard the click of a switch. A faint beam of yellow light shone beneath the door. The brothers figured that there was a corridor beyond, and 3 or 4 men had entered a room opening from it. "Well, I see you're still here," said the man who had been addressed as chief. "You'll find this an easier place to get into than out of." A weary voice answered him. The tones were low, so the boys pressed closer to the door, but try as they may, they could not distinguish the words. "You're a prisoner here, and you'll stay here until you die, unless you write that note." Again, the weary voice spoke, but the tones were still so indistinct that the boys could not hear the answer. "You won't write it, eh? Well, we'll see what we can do to persuade you." "Let him go hungry for a few days. That'll persuade him." put in one of the other men. This brought on a hoarse laugh from his companions. You'll be hungry enough if you won't write that letter, the chief agreed. Are you going to write it? No, the boys barely heard the prisoner answer. The chief said sourly, You've got too much on us. We can't afford to let you go now. But if you write that letter, we'll leave you some food so that you won't starve. You'll break out eventually, but not in time to do us any harm. Well, what do you say? Want some food? There was no reply from the prisoner. Give his arm a little twist, suggested one of the smugglers. At this, the Hardys' blood boiled with rage. Their first impulse was to fling open the door and rush to the aid of the person who was being tormented. But they realized they were helpless against so many men. Their only hope lay in the arrival of the Coast Guard men. But they might come too late. Chief, shall I call this guy the works? One of the smugglers asked. No, the leader answered quickly. None of that rough stuff. We'll do it the easy way. Starvation. I'm giving him one more chance. He can write that note now, or we'll leave him here to starve when we make our getaway. Still, there was no reply. To Frank and Joe's ears came a scraping sound as if a chair was being moved forward. You won't talk, eh? The leader's voice grew ugly. There was a pause of a few seconds. Then suddenly he shouted, Write that note, Hardy, or you'll be sorry, as sure as my name's Snapman. Chapter 14, Captured. Joe gave a start. It is Dad, he whispered hoarsely. He found the smuggler's hideout. Frank nudged his brother warningly. Not so loud. The boys' worst fears were realized. Their father was not only a prisoner of the smugglers, but also his life was being threatened. Write that note. Write that note, Snapman demanded. I won't write it, Fenton Hardy replied in a weak but clear voice. The chief persisted. You heard what I said. Write it or be left here to starve. I'll starve. You'll change your mind in a day or two. You think you're hungry now, but wait until we cut off your food entirely. Then you'll see. You'll be ready to sell your soul for a drop of water or a crumb to eat. I won't write it. Look here, Hardy, we're not asking very much. All we want you to do is write to your wife that you're safe. Tell her to call off the police and those kids of yours. They're too nosy. Sooner or later, someone is going to trace me here, came Mr. Hardy's faint reply. And when they do, I can tell them enough to send you to prison for the rest of your life. There was a sudden commotion in the room, and 2 or 3 of the smugglers began talking at once. You're crazy, shouted Snapman, but there was a hint of uneasiness in his voice. You don't know anything about me. I know enough to have you sent up for attempted murder, and you're about to try it again. You're too smart, Hardy. That's all the more reason we're not going to let you get out of here until we've gone. And if you don't cooperate, you'll never make it. Our next big shipment's coming through tonight, and then we're skipping the country. If you write that letter, you'll live. If you don't, it's curtains for you. Frank and Joe were shaken by the dire threats, but they must decide whether to go for help or stay and risk capture and try to rescue their father. You can't scare me, Snapman, the detective said. I have a feeling your time is up. You're never going to get that big shipment. The detective's voice seemed a little stronger, the boys felt. Snapman laughed. I thought you were smart, but you're playing a losing game. I warn you. And how about your family? Are you doing them a service by being so stubborn? There was silence for a while. Then Fenton Hardy answered slowly. My wife and boys would rather know that I died doing my duty than have me come back to them as a protector of smugglers and criminals. You have a very high sense of duty, sneered Snapman, but you'll change your mind. Are you thirsty? There was no reply. Are you hungry? Still no answer. You know you are, and it'll be worse. You'll die of thirst and starvation until you write that note. I'll never write it. All right. Come on, men. We'll leave him to himself for a while and give him time to think about it. Frank squeezed Joe's arm in relief and exhilaration. There was still a chance to save their father. Footsteps echoed as Snapman and the others left the room and walked through the corridor. Finally, the sounds died away and a door slammed. Joe made a move toward the door, but Frank held him back. We'd better wait a minute, he cautioned. They may have left someone on guard. The boys stood still, listening intently, but there were no further sounds from beyond the door. At length, satisfied that his father had indeed been left alone, Frank felt for the doorknob. Noiselessly, he opened the door about an inch, then peered into the corridor, which was dimly lighted from one overhead bulb. There was no sign of a guard. 3 doors opened from the corridor, 2 on the opposite side from where the brothers were standing, and another at the end. The passage was floored with planks, and had a beamed ceiling like a cellar. Frank and Joe quickly figured where their father was, and sped across the planks to the room. They pushed open the door of the almost dark room and peered inside. There was a crude table and several chairs. In one corner stood a small cot. On it lay Fenton Hardy. He was bound hand and foot to a bed, and so tightly trussed that he was unable to move more than a few inches in any direction. He was flat on his back, staring up at the ceiling of his prison. On a chair beside the cot was a sheet of paper and a pencil, evidently the materials for the letter Snapman had demanded he write. "Dad," Frank and Joe cried softly. The detective had not heard the door open, but now he looked at his sons in amazement and relief. "You're here," he whispered. "Thank goodness." The boys were shocked at the change in their father's appearance. Normally a rugged-looking man, Fenton Hardy now was very thin and pale. His cheeks were sunken and his eyes listless. "We'll have you out of here in a minute," Frank whispered. "Hurry," the detective begged. "Those demons may be back any minute." Frank pulled out his pocket knife and began to work at the ropes that bound his father, but the knife was not very sharp and the bonds were thick. Joe discovered that he did not have his knife with him. "It probably slipped out of my pocket when we undressed at the Napoli," he said. "Mine's gone too," Mr. Hardy told them. "Snapman took everything I had in my pockets, including concentrated emergency rations. Have you anything sweet with you?" Joe pulled out the candy bar from his pocket and held it so Mr. Hardy could take a large bite of the quick energy food. Meanwhile, his eyes roamed over the room in search of something sharp which he might use to help Frank with the ropes. He saw nothing. Mr. Hardy finished the candy bar bite by bite. Now Joe started to help Frank by trying to untie the knots, but they were tight, and he found it almost impossible to loosen them. Minutes later, Frank hacked at the ropes, but the dull blade made little progress. Joe worked at the obstinate knots. Fenton Hardy could give no assistance. All were silent. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the boys and the scraping of the knife against the ropes. At last, Frank was able to saw through one of the bonds, and the detective's feet were free. His son pulled the ropes away and began to work on the other ones that bound his father's arms. As he reached over with the knife, there came a sound that sent a feeling of terror through the Hardys. It was a heavy footstep beyond the corridor door. Someone was coming back. Frank worked desperately with the knife, but the rope still held stubbornly. The dull blade seemed to make almost no impression, but at last a few strands parted. Finally, with Fenton Hardy making a mighty effort and Joe clawing at the rope with his fingers, it snapped. The detective was free, but the footfalls of the approaching smuggler came closer. "Quiet and quick," Frank whispered as he flung the ropes aside. "I can't hurry," Mr. Hardy gasped. "I've been tied up so long my feet and legs are numb. But we've got to go, Dad," Frank said excitedly. "See if you can stand up." "I'll do my best," his father replied as the boys rubbed his legs vigorously to restore full circulation. "We must run before those crooks come," Joe said tensely. Fenton Hardy got to his feet as hastily as he could, but when he stood up, the detective staggered and would have fallen if Frank had not taken his arm. He was so weak from hunger that a wave of dizziness had come over him. He gave his head a quick shake, and the feeling passed. "All right, let's go," he said, clinging to both boys for support. The three hastened out the door of the room and across the corridor to the cave. As they entered it, Mr. Hardy's knees buckled. In desperation, his son picked him up. "You go on," he whispered. "Leave me here. I'm sure all of us can make it," Joe said bravely. They reached the far door, but the delay had been costly. Just as Frank opened it, clicking off his flashlight, the corridor door was flung open and the ceiling lights snapped on. Frank leaped directly at the smuggler. Frank and Joe had a confused glimpse of the dark man whom they had seen at the pond that afternoon. Snapman. Two rough-looking companions crowded in behind him. "What's going on here?" Snapman exclaimed, apparently not recognizing the group for a moment. "It's the Hardys!" one of the other men cried out. The fleeing trio started down the steps, but got no farther than the landing when the smugglers appeared at the stairway and rushed down after them. "Stop!" cried Snapman, jumping down the last 3 steps and whipping an automatic from his hip pocket. The place was flooded with light. As Snapman drew closer, Frank crouched for a spring, then leaped directly at the smuggler. He struck at the man's wrist and the revolver flew out of his grasp. It skidded across the landing and clattered down some steps. Frank closed in on the man. Snapman had been taken completely by surprise. Before he could defend himself, Frank forced him against the wall. Joe, in the meantime, with a swift uppercut, had KO'd one of the other men, and Mr. Hardy, whose strength had partially returned, was battling the third as best he could. But at this moment, the boys saw their father's adversary dodge to the wall and press a button. In an instant, an alarm bell sounded in the corridor. Within seconds, a new group of Snapman's gang appeared. As some held drawn revolvers, others overpowered the 3 Hardys. In the face of the guns, father and sons were forced to surrender and return to the room where Mr. Hardy had been held captive before. Within 5 minutes, Fenton Hardy was bound again to the cot, while Frank and Joe, trussed up and unable to move, were tied to 2 chairs. Chapter 15, Dire Threats. Snapman, once he had recovered from his first consternation and surprise at finding the Hardy boys in the underground room, was in high good humor. He turned to his men. "Just in time," he gloated, rubbing his hands together in satisfaction. "If you hadn't come here when we did, they'd all have escaped." The Hardy boys were silent, sick with despair. They had been sure they were going to succeed in rescuing their father, and now the 3 of them were prisoners of the smuggling gang. "What are we going to do with these guys?" asked one of the men. The voice sounded familiar to the boys, and they looked up. They were not surprised to see that the man was the red-haired one they had met at the Pollitt place when Frank had discovered his father's cap. "Do with them?" Snapman missed. "That's a problem. We've got 3 on our hands now instead of 1. Best thing to do is leave them here and lock the door and put gags in their traps," suggested a burly companion. Red objected. "As long as the Hardys are around here, they're dangerous. They've almost got away this time." "Well, what do you suggest?" "We ought to do what I wanted to do with the old man in the first place," Red declared doggedly. "You mean get rid of them?" Snapman asked thoughtfully. "Sure, all of them." "Well," Snapman gazed at Mr. Hardy with the sinister look, I should think you have enough on your conscience already, Snapman," the detective exclaimed. "I don't expect you to let me go," he added bitterly, "but release my boys. They haven't done anything but try to rescue their father. You did the same thing yourself." "Oh, yeah?" Snapman sneered. "Don't bother yourself about my conscience. Nobody ever stands in my way." "As to letting these boys go, what kind of fool do you take me for?" Snapman shouted. If you 3 are such buddies, you ought to enjoy starving together." The smuggler laughed uproariously, and then at what he considered a very funny remark. Frank's and Joe's mind were racing with ideas. One thing stood out clearly. Snapman had said the Hardys almost escaped. This meant that no one was guarding the secret entrance. "If we can only hold out a while," they thought, "the Coast Guard will arrive. There'll be nobody to stop them from coming up here." Then, suddenly, a shocking possibility occurred to the boys. Suppose the Coast Guard could not find the camouflaged door opening from the pond. During the conversation, 4 of the smugglers had been whispering among themselves in the corridor. One of them now stepped into the room and faced Snapman. "I'd like a word with you, Chief," he said. "What is it now?" The smuggler's voice was surly. "It's about what's to be done with the Hardys, now that we've got him," the man said hesitantly. "It's your business what you do to people who make it tough for you when you're on your own, but not in our gang. We're in this for our take out of the smuggling, and we don't want to stand for much rough stuff." "That's right," one of the other men spoke up. "Is that so?" Snapman's upper lip curled. "You guys are getting awful righteous all of a sudden, aren't you? Look out or I'll dump the lot on you." "Oh, no, you won't," replied the first man who had addressed them. "We're partners in this deal, and we're going to have our full share of what comes in. We ain't risking our lives for love, you know." "We've got another idea about what to do with the 3 prisoners," a third smuggler spoke up. "I think it's a good one." "What is it?" Snapman asked impatiently. "We've been talking about Ally Singe." Frank and Joe started and listened intently. "What about him?" Snapman prodded his assistant. "Turn the prisoners over to him. He's got a friend named Foster who's captain of a boat sailing to the Far East tonight. Put the Hardys on board that ship," the first smuggler urged. Snapman looked thoughtful. The idea seemed to catch his fancy. "Not bad," he muttered. "I hadn't thought of Ally Singe, but yes, he'd take care of them. They'd never get back here." He smiled grimly. "From what he told me about that friend of his, the captain probably dumped the Hardys overboard before they even got far out." The man went on smugly. "Seems like he don't feed passengers if he can't get rid of them." "All the better. We wouldn't be responsible. Leave them to Ally Singe," Red chuckled evilly. "He'll attend to them." Snapman walked over to the cot and looked down at Mr. Hardy. "It's too bad your boys had to come barging in here," he said. "Now the 3 of you will have to take a little ocean voyage." He laughed. "You'll never get to the Coast Guard to tell your story." The detective was silent. He knew further attempts at persuasion would be useless. "Well," said Snapman, "haven't you anything to say?" "Nothing. Do as you wish with me, but let the boys go." "We'll stick with you, Dad," said Frank quickly. "Of course," Joe added. "You sure will," Snapman declared. I'm not going to let you, one of you, have the chance of getting back to Bayport with your story." The ringleader of the smugglers stood in the center of the room for a while, contemplating his captives with a bitter smile. Then he turned suddenly on his heel. "Well, they're safe enough," he told Red. "We have that business with Burke to take care of. Come on, men, load Burke's truck. If any policemen come along and find it in the lane, we'll be done for." "How about them?" asked Red, motioning to the Hardys. "Shouldn't they be guarded?" Let's tie up tight. They're tied up tight." Snapman gave a short laugh. "But I guess we'd better leave one guard anyway. Malloy, you can stay here and keep watch." Malloy, a surly truculent fellow in overalls and a ragged sweater, nodded and sat down on a box near the door. This arrangement seemed to satisfy Snapman. After warning Malloy not to fall asleep on the job and to see to it that the prisoners did not escape, he left the room. He was followed by Red and the other smugglers. A heavy silence fell over the room after the departure of the men. Malloy crouched gloomily on the box, gazing blankly at the floor. The butt of a revolver projected from his hip pocket. Frank strained against the ropes that bound him to the chair, but the smugglers had done their task well. He could scarcely budge. "We'll never get out of this," he told himself ruefully. Joe was usually optimistic, but this time his spirits failed him. "We're in a tough spot," he thought. "It looks as if we'll all be on a ship by morning." To lighten their spirits, the Hardys began to talk, hoping against hope, to distract the guard and perhaps overpower him. "Shut up, you guys," Malloy growled. "Quit your talking, or I'll make it hot for you." He tapped his revolver suggestively. After that, a melancholy silence fell among the prisoners. All were downhearted. It looked as if their fate truly were sealed. Chapter 16. Quick work. In despair, the boys glanced over at their father on the cot. To their surprise, they saw that he was smiling. Frank was about to ask him what he had found amusing about their predicament when his father shook his head in warning. He looked over at the guard. Malloy was not watching the prisoners. He sat staring at the floor. Occasionally his head would fall forward. Then he would jerk it back as if he struggled to keep awake. Snapman sure made a poor selection when he chose Malloy as guard, the boys thought. Several times the burly man straightened up, stretched his arms, and rubbed his eyes. But when he settled down again, his head began to nod. In the meantime, the boys noticed their father struggling with his bonds. To their amazement, he did not seem to be so tightly bound as they had thought. Both of them tried moving, but could not budge an inch. The boys exchanged glances, both realizing what had happened. Dad resorted to an old trick, Frank told himself, and Joe was silently fuming. Why didn't we think of it? Mr. Hardy had profited by his previous experience. When the smugglers had seized the detective and tied him to the cot for the second time, he had used a device frequently employed by magicians and professional escape artists, who boast that they can release themselves from tightly tied ropes and straitjackets. The detective had expanded his chest and flexed his muscles. He had also kept his arms as far away from his sides as he could without being noticed. In this way, when he relaxed, the ropes did not bind him as securely as his captors intended. Oh, why were Frank and I so dumb? Joe again chided himself. Frank bit his lip in utter disgust at not having remembered the trick, but then he eased his conscience. Dad didn't think of it the first time either. Mr. Hardy had discovered that the rope binding his right wrist to the cot had a slight slack in it. He began trying to work the rope loose. This took a long time, and the rope strands rubbed his wrist raw, but at last he managed to slide his right hand free. "Hooray!" Frank almost shouted. He glanced at the guard. Malloy appeared to be sound asleep. "Hope he'll stay that way until we escape," Frank wished fervently. He and Joe watched their father in amazement. As they saw him grope for one of the knots, the detective fumed at it for a while. It was slow work, with only his one hand free, but the boys knew from his satisfied expression that the smugglers, in their haste, apparently had not tied the knots as firmly as they should have. At this instant, the guard suddenly lifted his head, and Mr. Hardy quickly laid his hand free back on the cot. He closed his eyes as if sleeping, and his sons followed his example. But opening their lids a slit, they watched the smuggler carefully. The guard grunted. "They're okay," he mumbled. Once more he tried to stay awake, but found it impossible. Little by little his head sagged until his chin rested on his chest. Deep, regular breathing told the prisoners he was asleep. Mr. Hardy now began work again on the knot of the rope that kept his left arm bound to the cot. In a matter of moments he succeeded in loosening it, and the rope fell away from his arm. After making sure the guard was still asleep, the detective sat up on the cot and struggled to release his feet. This was an easier task. The smugglers had merely passed a rope around the cot to hold the prisoner's feet. A few minutes' attention was all that was necessary for the boy's father to work his way loose. "Now he'll release us," Joe thought excitedly, "and then we'll be free to escape from here." As Fenton Hardy tiptoed toward his sons, the board floor squeaked loudly. The guard muttered again as if dreaming, shook his head, then sat up. "Oh no," Frank murmured, fearful of what would happen. He saw his father pick up a white rag someone had dropped. A look of amazement crossed Malloy's face. As he opened his mouth to yell for help, Fenton Hardy leaped across the intervening space and flung himself on the smuggler. "Keep quiet," the detective ordered. Malloy had time only to utter a muffled gasp before the detective clapped a hand over the guard's mouth, jammed a rag in it, and toppled him to the floor. The two rolled over and over in a desperate, silent struggle. The boys helplessly looked on, their fears mounting. They knew their father had been weakened by his imprisonment and hunger, and the guard was strong and muscular. Nevertheless, the detective had the advantage of the surprise attack. Malloy had no time to collect his wits. Frank and Joe watched the battle in an agony of suspense. If only they could join the fight. Mr. Hardy still had the advantage, for he could breathe better than his opponent. But suddenly Malloy managed to raise himself to his knees. He reached for the revolver at his hip. "Look out, Dad!" Frank hissed. "He's got a gun." Quick as a flash, the detective landed a blow on the guard's jaw. Malloy blinked and raised both hands to defend himself as he fell to the ground. Mr. Hardy darted forward and pulled the revolver out of the man's side pocket. "No funny business," the detective told them in a low voice. Without being told, Malloy raised his hands in the air. He sat helplessly on the floor, beaten. "He's got a knife too, Dad," Joe said quietly. "Watch that." "Thanks, Joe," his father replied. Then, motioning with the pistol, he said, "All right, let's have the knife." Suddenly, the guard removed the knife from its leather sheath at the belt and handed it to Mr. Hardy. Frank and Joe wanted to shout with joy, but merely grinned at their father. Still watching Malloy, the detective walked slowly backward until he reached Joe's side. Without taking his eyes from the smuggler, he bent down and with the knife sliced at the ropes that bound his son. Fortunately, the knife was sharp and the ropes soon were cut. "Boy, that feels good, Dad, thanks," Joe whispered. He sprang from the chair, took the knife, and while his father watched Malloy, he cut Frank's bonds. "Malloy," Mr. Hardy ordered, "come over here." He motioned toward the bed and indicated by gestures that the smuggler was to lie down on the cot. Malloy shook his head vigorously, but was prodded over by Joe. The guard lay down on the cot. The ropes which had held Mr. Hardy had not been cut. Quickly, Frank and Joe trussed up Malloy just as their father had been tied, making certain that the knots were tight. As a final precaution, they pushed in the gag, which was slipping, and with a piece of rope made it secure. The whole procedure had taken scarcely 5 minutes. The Hardys were free. "What now?" Frank asked his father out of earnest earshot of Malloy. "Hide someplace until the Coast Guard gets here." Quickly he told about Tony and Chet going to bring the officers to the smugglers' hideout. "But they should have been here by now," Joe whispered. "They probably haven't found the secret door. Let's go down and show them." This plan was agreed upon, but the three Hardys got no further than the top of the first stairway when they heard rough, arguing voices below them. "They can't be Coast Guard men," said Mr. Hardy. We'll listen a few minutes, and then we better run in the other direction. I know the way out to the grounds." From below came an ugly, "You double-crosser, you. The loot belongs to the whole gang, and don't you forget it." "Listen," said the second voice, "I don't have to take orders from you. I thought we was pals. Now you don't want to go through with the deal. Who's to know if we got 10 packages or 5 from that friend, Ally Singe? Okay, and the stuff will be easier to get rid of than those drugs. They're too hot for me. Snapman can burn for kidnapping if he wants to. I don't." The voices had now become loud, so loud that the Hardys did not dare wait another moment. "Come on," the boy's father urged. He led the way back to the corridor and along it to the door at the end. Suddenly, Frank and Joe noticed him falter and were afraid he was going to faint. Joe recalled that his father had had no food except the candy bar. Ramming his hands into his pockets, he brought out another bar and some pieces of pretzel. Quickly, he filled both his father's hands with them. Mr. Hardy ate them hungrily as his boy supported him under his arms and assisted him to the door. As Frank quietly opened it, and they saw a stairway beyond, the detective said, "These steps will bring us up into a shed near the Pollitt house. There's a trap door. That's the way Snapman brought us down, right? Got your lights? We haven't got any time to lose." Mr. Hardy seemed stronger already. "I'll take the lead." As they ascended, Frank and Joe wondered if they would come out in the shed where they had seen the man named Klein picking up small logs. When the detective reached the top of the stairs, he ordered the lights out and pushed again the trap door. He could not budge it. "You try," he urged the boys, "and hurry. Those men we heard may discover Malloy." "And then things will start popping," Frank murmured. The boys heaved their shoulders against the trap door. In a moment, there came the rumble of rolling logs. The door went up easily. Frank peered out. No one seemed to be around. He stepped up into the shed, and the others followed. The three stood in silence. The night was dark. The wind, blowing through the trees, made a moaning sound. Before the Hardys rose the gloomy mass of the house on the hill. No lights could be seen. From the direction of the lane came dull, thudding sounds. The boy and their father assumed the smuggler's truck was being loaded with the goods, which were to be disposed of by the man named Burke. Suddenly, the Hardys heard voices from the corridor they had just left. Quickly, Frank closed the trap door and Joe piled up the logs. Then suddenly, the Hardys stole out into the yard. Chapter 12, Hostages. Lithe as Indians, the three Hardys hurried across the lawn and disappeared among the trees. They headed for the road, a good distance away. "I hope a bus comes along," Frank said to himself. "Then we can get to a phone and report." His thought was rudely interrupted as the boys and their father heard a sound that struck terror to their hearts, the clatter of the logs tumbling off the trap door. An instant later came a hoarse shout. "Chief! Red! The Hardys got away! Watch out for them!" "He must be one of the men we heard coming up from the shore," Joe decided. "They must have found Malloy trussed up." Instantly, the place became alive with smugglers flashing their lights. Some of the men ran from the truck toward the road, shouting. Others began to comb the woods. Another man emerged from the trap door. He and his companion dashed to the ocean side of the house. Two burly smugglers flung open the kitchen door and ran out. One shouted, they ain't in the house. "And they're not down at the shore," the other yelled. "I just talked to Klein on the phone down there." "You guys better not let those Hardys get away." Snapman's voice cut through the night. "It'll be the pen for all of you. Fenton Hardy's got a gun. He took Malloy's," came a warning voice from the far side of the house. The two men who had gone to the front now returned. "He never misses his mark." When the fracas had started, the detective had pulled his sons to the ground, told them to lie flat, face down, and not move. Now they could hear the pounding steps of the smugglers as they dashed among the trees. The boys' hearts pounded wildly. It did not seem possible that they could be missed. Yet man after man ran within a few yards of the three prone figures and dashed on toward the road. Presently Mr. Hardy raised his head and looked toward the Pollock mansion. "Boys," he said tensely, "we'll make a run for the kitchen door. The men won't expect us to go there." The three arose. Swiftly and silently they crossed the dark lawn and slipped into the house. Apparently no one had seen them. "When Snapman doesn't find us outdoors," Joe whispered, "won't he look here to make sure?" "Yes," Mr. Hartley replied, "but by that time I hope the Coast Guard and State Pen will arrive." Joe and I found a hidden stairway to the attic. Frank spoke up. "Snapman won't think of looking in it. Let's go hide up there." "You forget the ghost," Joe reminded his brother. "He knows we found that stairway." "Nevertheless, Frank's suggestion is a good one," Mr. Hardy said. "Let's go to the attic." "Were any clothes hanging in the closet that might be used to conceal the door?" "Yes, a man's bathrobe on a rod." The Hardys did not dare use a light and had to make their way along by feeling the walls and the stair banister, with Frank in the lead and Mr. Hardy between the boys. Reaching the second floor, Frank looked out the rear window of the hall. "The smugglers are coming back," he remarked in a low voice. "The lights are heading this way." The Hardys doubled their speed, but it was still slow going, for they banged into chairs and a wardrobe as Frank felt his way along the hall toward the bedroom where the hidden staircase was. Finally, the trio reached it, just as Frank was about to open the door to the attic. A door on the first floor swung open with a resounding bang. "Scatter and search every room," Snapman's crisp voice rang out. "We're trapped," Joe groaned. "Maybe not," Frank said hopefully. "I have a hunch Klein was the ghost. It's possible that he's the only one who knows about this stairway, and he's down at the shore." "We'll risk going up," Mr. Hardy decided, but not a sound. He slid the bathrobe across the rod so that it would hide the door. The stairs creak. Joe informed him. Mr. Hardy told his sons to push down the treads slowly but firmly with their hands and hold them there until they could put one foot between them and then raise up to their full weight. And lean forward so you don't lose your balance, he warned. Fearful that he could not accomplish this, Frank opened the door carefully and started up in the pitch blackness, but the dread thought of capture made him use extreme caution, and he reached the attic without having made a sound. After closing the door, Joe and his father quickly followed. The three moved noiselessly to a spot out of sight of the stairway, behind a large trunk. They sat down and waited, not daring even a whisper. From downstairs they could hear running footsteps, banging doors, and loud talk. Not here, not here, not here. The search seemed to come to an end, for the second floor group had gathered right in the room where the secret stairway was. This is it, the end. They're going to search up here, Frank thought woefully. His father reached over and grasped the hand of each of his sons in a reassuring grip. Someone yanked open the door. The Hardys became tense. Would the robe over the entrance to the secret stairway fool him? Empty, the man announced and shut the door. The smugglers went downstairs. There were fervent handshakes among the detective and his sons. Other than this, they did not move a muscle of their bodies, although they inwardly relaxed. Now new worries assailed the Hardys. It was possible that Snapman and his gang, having been alerted, would move out and disappear before the police or Coast Guard could get to the house on the cliff. Frank's heart gave a jump. He suddenly realized that his father was hiding to protect his sons. Had he been alone, the intrepid detective would have been downstairs battling to get the better of Snapman and break up the smuggling ring. What a swell father he is, Frank thought. Then another idea came to him. Maybe being here isn't such a bad idea or plan after all. Dad might have been fatally shot if he'd been anywhere else on the property. A moment later, the Hardys again became aware of voices on the second floor. They recognized one as Snapman's, the other as Klein's. Yeah, there's a secret stairway to the attic, Klein announced. I found it there when I was playing Ghost. And them Hardy boys, they found it too. I'll bet my last take on those rare drugs we're getting tonight that the Dick and his sons are up in that attic. The Hardys' spirits sank. They were going to be captured again after all. They heard the door at the foot of the stairway open. Go up and look, Klein, ordered Snapman. Not me. Fenton Hardy has Malloy's gun. I said, go up. You can't make me, Klein objected in a whining tone. I'd be a sure target, 'cause I couldn't see him. He'd be hiding and let me have it so quick I'd never know what hit me. Despite the grave situation, Frank and Joe's faces were creased in smiles, but they faded as Snapman said, I'll go up myself. Give me that big light. Suddenly, a brilliant beam was cast into the attic. It moved upward, accompanied by heavy footsteps. Hardy, if you want to live, say so, Snapman said, an evil ring in his voice. No answer from the detective. We've got you cornered this time. Mr. Hardy did not reply. Listen, Hardy, Snapman shouted. I know you're up there because you moved that bathrobe. I'll give you just 1 minute to come down out of that attic. Still no answer, and an interval of silence followed. Then came Snapman's voice again. This is your last chance, Hardy. Nearly a minute went by without a sign from the two enemy camps. Then Snapman moved up the stairs and a few more steps. Hardy, I have a proposition to make to you, he said presently. I know you don't want to die, and you want those boys of yours to live too. Well, so do I want to live, so let's call it quits. The detective maintained his silence, and Snapman continued by the steps. Give you my word I won't shoot, and I know you never fire unless you have to. A moment later, he appeared at the top of the stairs, empty-handed except for the light. In a moment, he spotted the Hardys with his high-powered flashlight. Here's the proposition. Your lives in exchange for mine and my gang's. How do you mean? Mr. Hardy asked coldly. I mean, the smuggler said, that you are my hostages. Hostages? Frank and Joe exclaimed together. Yes, if my men and I can get our stuff moved away before the police or the Coast Guard might happen in here, then you can leave a little later. But if they do come? Frank asked. Then I'll bargain with them, Snapman answered, and I don't think they'll turn me down. They don't know where you are, and I'll make them understand I mean business. Or if they take me, you three die. Frank and Joe gasped. The famous Fenton Hardy and his sons would be used as a shield to protect a ruthless gang of criminals. The boys looked at their father in consternation. To their amazement, he looked calm, but his mouth was drawn in a tight line. It won't do you any good to shoot me, Hardy, the smuggler said. Mallory said all the chambers in that gat are empty but one. If the gang hears you shot, they'll be up here in a minute to finish you all off properly. The Hardys realized that if Snapman's remark about the guns were true, they were indeed at the mercy of this cunning, scheming, conniving smuggler. He now started backing toward the stairway. I think I'm a pretty fair guy, he said, with that trace of a satisfied smile. And one to be hated and feared, Joe thought in a rage. We've got to outwit this man somehow, he determined. But at the moment, the possibility of this looked hopeless. And I'll stop right there since my battery is about to go, and we'll finish it off in the next portion. Okay, good night.